When my little brother Jerry got married, I was asked to step in as a bridesmaid for his wife-to-be. The guest list was a little thin on the bride's side, and he figured it'd be a good bonding experience. His fiancée, Susie, came from a small rural community back in Minnesota and didn't have a lot of family. Jerry had briefly mentioned that she was an orphan, and that it was sort of an off-limit topic to bring up. Not that I'd planned to. Susie and Jerry had met during his studies at MSU, and they'd been together for over 6 years before they made it official. These were two people who were more or less married already. On their wedding day, I tried my best to cater to Susie's needs. She seemed a bit down, but I figured it was just cold feet. I didn't want to pressure her, so I held my tongue and observed. There were a lot of little things that stood out to me. The way she sighed at her reflection. The way her eyes sunk when she saw the flower arrangements. She didn't say anything, but there was a sort of lulling discontent on her face. As we waited for the dress, I found her pouting on an ottoman outside the bathroom. I joined her, giving her a curious look. "It's all beautiful," I assured her. "All of it. I can tell you put a lot of thought into it." "It's not a big deal," she smiled. "But it's not perfect. I mean, nothing is, but you know." "I get it, yeah," I nodded. "Nothing's perfect." "It's not that, it's like..." She turned in her seat, facing me with a furrowed brow. "Nothing is really, truly beautiful. It's all right, but nothing is like I want it to be." "What would you change then?" I asked. "If you had more time?" "That's just the thing," she groaned. "I have no idea. It's just a feeling, you know?" There were a couple of surprises for Susie, though. Jerry had gone out of his way to make her happy. He had managed to track down her mother's wedding dress, something that had been put up for auction years ago when some of the family's estate was sold off to pay for Susie's education. He'd also made a bridal bouquet from the vivid pink flowers that grew in the backyard of her childhood home. These were all surprises, but he had backups on backups if she didn't like them. Green flags all around. When the dress arrived, Susie got this strange expression on her face. Like recognition, disbelief, and amazement all rolled into one. She cracked a smile and twirled around the room with it, hugging it like an old friend. It was certainly unique, an old-fashioned blend between a drop waist and empire cut. She held the dress up and stared at a mirror, speaking to me without looking away. "It's not perfect, but it's getting there," she smiled. "It's almost like I picture it. I feel it." I handed her the bridal bouquet, watching the pink petals reflect in her eyes. "I really do feel it. Right here." She put her hand on her stomach, smiling from ear to ear. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The walk down the aisle, the exchanging of vows. They walked out of the church to a church organ rendition of Tom Jones's Chills and Fever. That was also the first dance they shared at the reception. While my focus was on Jerry, I couldn't help but to look over at Susie every now and then. I caught her looking at her reflection a couple of times. She'd peer over the counter of the open bar and stare at herself in the mirror wall. I also noticed a bit of hesitance to throw the bridal bouquet. She couldn't keep her eyes off the pink petals. It's like she was mesmerized and wanted to keep it to herself. All in all, it turned into a good night. Lots of laughs, drinks, and dancing. But I couldn't help but to notice something strange in Susie's eyes. A light that wasn't there earlier that day. A couple of days turned into weeks, and life went on. I forgot about Susie and her wedding dress. That is, until Jerry called me up. He wanted to have lunch and catch up. Jerry and I have always had a good relationship, but we didn't really spend time on our own. We mostly just met for big events. To have him willingly seek me out rang some alarm bells. I met him at a cafe downtown. I had a sandwich. He got nothing, not even coffee. I could tell he was trying to keep a brave face, but there were worrying signs. I caught him yawning, and he had a slight shake to his hands. Something was clearly bothering him. I tried to get a read of him with some small talk, but it wasn't long until the conversation took a turn. "I want to talk about the wedding," he said. "Did Susie say something when she saw that dress?" "She loved it," I said, chewing on my sandwich. "Really loved it." "Yeah, but did she say anything? Anything strange? She mentioned it not being perfect. I nodded. But getting there, you know? Getting there? Yeah, like... I shrugged. I didn't know how to explain it. In fact, as I looked back on it, I had no idea what she meant. It felt like an off-the-shoulder comment, but maybe there was more to it. Jerry held his hands up. Look, he sighed. We've been having... issues. Turns out, their honeymoon didn't turn out as magical as one was led to believe. Susie had been obsessing over that wedding dress all week long. Jerry had once walked in on her wearing it in the bathroom, crying over how she wouldn't get a chance to wear it again. She said it made her feel beautiful, he explained, and how rare that was. Not wanting to see her sad on the first week of their life together, Jerry had just gone along with whatever Susie asked of him. She'd been wearing that dress pretty much all day long, even sleeping in it a couple of nights. For passers-by, it had been an amusing oddity, but Jerry was getting worried. Susie was having trouble keeping it together, and ever since they got back home, her behavior had taken a turn for the worse. Jerry had trouble talking about it. He kept touching his face, as if trying to hide what he was saying. He'd find Susie getting up at night to put the dress on, twisting and turning in front of the mirror to see herself at different angles. But it was more than just the dress. She'd begun making modifications. The dress wasn't perfect, and she was obsessed with this idea of making it what it could be. It started with hand-weaving a couple of blue threads into the edges of the dress, but lately, she'd turned to accessorizing, turning away from the dress and onto herself. The perfect makeup, the right shade of nail polish, that kind of thing, Jerry explained. I've seen her looking up tattoo places around town. I don't know what to say. Look, you married her, I smiled. In sickness and health. Just be there for her, Jerry. I'm all about that, he nodded. But this ain't normal, and I don't know where it's gonna stop. Jerry leaned back, dragging his hands across his face. She scares me. I got a couple of updates over the next few days. Susie had changed her hair, her nails, and she was wearing her makeup in an unusual way. Jerry had trouble explaining it. He had managed to dissuade her from getting her face tattooed, but just a day later, he had to stop her again, this time from scarring her own face with a nail clipper. It was getting serious. We texted back and forth, trying to figure out what to do and who to talk to. It was obvious that Susie was having trouble that we couldn't begin to understand. Something had just snapped when she put that dress on. The same dress she'd obsessed over all her life. The one exactly like the one her mother had worn. Which got me thinking, what had really happened to her parents? Not even Jerry knew. It was the one thing that Susie refused to talk about. Then Jerry stopped responding. It was sudden, so I decided to pay him a visit. In all the years that he and Susie had been together, I'd never heard of them having this kind of issue before. I had no idea what to expect. These two were like the baseline picture of what a healthy relationship should look like, and all of a sudden, it had just collapsed. I drove by their home, a row house in a calm residential area. It didn't take long to see that something was wrong. There were neighbors outside and a squad car on the driveway. People were about to scatter back to where they came from, leaving only Jerry and 2 police officers. They were finishing up as I approached. I caught the glimpse of a conversation ending with Jerry being asked to reconsider something. And that was that. The moment I approached, he gave me a hug. I'd never been hugged like that before, like he was holding on for dear life. He peered inside his home, as if checking for Susie, and told me the story with a hushed tone. Susie had gone off the rails. She'd torn out chunks of her hair and chewed dirt to stain her mouth with the right color. The final straw had been trying to staple her ears to the side of her head, and that's where Jerry had intervened. Things had gone from bad to worse. She says I'm keeping her from perfection, he said. She says I'm holding her back. Susie had attacked him, thrown things, screamed, broken furniture. She had wreaked havoc on their home, completely remorseless. That's why the police were there. The neighbors had called them. But instead of pressing charges, Jerry had dismissed them. He was going to get Susie help personally. He didn't want her to end up in a cell. She needed treatment, and he needed my help to move her. As we stepped inside their home, I could tell it hadn't been a little spat. There was broken glass strewn across the floor, a broken chair, and every painting had been thrown across the room. Susie was sitting on the living room couch in what remained of her torn wedding dress. It had been stained with patches of green, brown, and blue. She had large red bald patches on her head, and she'd applied all kinds of makeup seemingly at random. She was slowly dancing with her arms, like she was playing an invisible harp. She said something about her movements being part of her new aesthetic, Jerry explained. She's been like that for the past 20 minutes or so. I took a few steps closer, making sure not to interrupt her movements. They were choppy and artificial, like a buffering video. She had one eye fixed on her hands, and the other eye moving at random. It was impossible to tell if she was paying attention to us. If I hadn't known it was her, there'd be no way to recognize her. Apart from all the things she'd done to herself, she'd also lost a lot of weight. Still, she seemed happy. Maybe even happier than she'd been at the wedding. Jerry moved up behind her and slowly put his hands around her torso. With a little nudging, she got the message and stood up, careful not to miss any arm movements. I moved ahead, making sure there was nothing in the way. It felt like moving a glass figurine. We had no idea what could break her. We managed to get her in the car. Jerry asked me to follow in my own car, but I refused. I didn't want to leave him alone with her, especially not going down a highway. I ended up behind the wheel as Jerry and Susie stayed in the back seat. He had a place in mind, one he'd been in contact with over the past week or so. They were mostly for emergencies, but there'd been nothing but luck keeping this breakdown from causing serious damage. I didn't want to think about what would have happened if she'd been in the kitchen, by the knives. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when I suddenly heard a snap. Then another. Looking over, I saw Susie furiously pulling at her fingers, almost tearing them out of their sockets. Jerry threw himself at her. "No!" she cried. "They need to be the same length. They need to be the same." By the time we got to the address Jerry had given me, the back seat was pandemonium. Susie was screeching like an animal, scratching and tearing at Jerry to get away. I saw two men running out of a nearby building to help us. A door opened, and Susie was grabbed. She screamed at them to let her go, to let her fix her fingers, and Jerry screamed back. I barely understood what happened until I was alone in the car, watching Jerry and two men in white uniforms take Susie away. A couple of minutes later, I got a text saying I was good to go, and a thank you. Coming home later that night, I took a long look at myself in the mirror. I tried my best to figure out what Susie was obsessing about, but there was no logic to it. Sure, I have my flaws, and she did too, but whatever she was doing wasn't helping. What kind of ideal was she really pursuing? I talked to Jerry just before I went to bed. Susie was in good hands for the time being, and he was at home, sleeping alone for the first time in years. I could tell it was bothering him. "I don't know what she's looking for," he sighed. "It's like she wants something perfect, but she just destroys herself." "Maybe she's got another idea of what's perfect and what isn't," I said. "Maybe, yeah," he agreed. "But some of the stuff she says, it's not just changing your nails or your hair. She says things sometimes when she thinks I don't hear." "Like what?" He took a deep breath. I could tell he was in the bathroom. Had he been crying? Like she's wishing for more arms, or to be taller, or to be transparent. Things were quiet for a couple of days after. I reached out to Jerry, but I didn't get a lot back. A quick text every now and then to tell me he was doing okay. Susie was getting the help she needed, but she wasn't improving. At least we'd stopped her from getting worse. I thought about it a lot. Everything had changed the moment she saw that dress. Sure, it had been unique, but what was so special about it? I asked Jerry's permission to ask around and show a few pictures of it. There were also a few cuts that Susie had discarded, which I could use to show off the fabric. I talked to a couple of professionals around town. Most of them didn't have a lot to say or dismissed me entirely. It took me half a day before I found this old woman at a hidden-away private tailor downtown that I could get some answers. They were about to close, but she took some time out of her day to help. She had never seen that cut before, despite having worked with wedding dresses for close to 40 years. It had to be a custom job. But what seemed to vex her the most was the fabric. "It's not charmeuse or georgette," she pondered. "A sateen blend? No." She compared it to a couple of her own fabric samples, but came up with nothing. We were about to give up when she caught a glimpse of her husband having a cigarette outside. She got an idea and asked my permission to set the fabric on fire. Apparently, that's a way you can get a rough idea about the nature of the textile. Now, this piece of fabric was just a small square, no bigger than the palm of my hand. But she borrowed her husband's lighter, put the square down, and set it on fire. The reaction was immediate. It bulged in the middle as a dozen little branch-like extremities poked out of it. They grew, twisting and turning like a dying snake. The fabric turned from a bright white to a dark blue with a metallic sheen. The branches grew thicker, reaching further and further out, morphing into a petal-like flat surface. By the time the whole square was consumed by fire, it had spread out like a chemical grenade had gone off. At a distance, it was almost pretty, like a blue sunflower. She didn't have the slightest idea what it was supposed to be. The only thing she knew was that she wanted it out of her store, and that she needed to wipe down every surface it had touched with chlorine. I had the image of that fabric twisting and turning under the flames in my head for a couple of days. It was something animalistic about it, like a living, breathing thing. I thought about calling up Jerry to ask for more scraps that I could ask someone else about, maybe a chemist. But I didn't get the opportunity. It was a Thursday, around 2 a.m. Jerry called me, breathing heavily into the phone. He'd been running. Apparently, there was an issue with Susie. She'd gotten out, and they needed people to help find her. That's all he knew. There was no question about it. Of course I was going to help. I met up with Jerry and made my way out to the mental health facility we dropped her off at. We drove past the sign with the Hatchet corporate logo and got stopped at the entrance by an armed guard. Jerry explained that we were there to help with the search, and we were let in. We were to take a detour from the main entrance, though, so I only caught a glimpse of what was happening in there. Whatever Susie had done, it was big news. 2 ambulances, several police vehicles, and about half a dozen unmarked black vehicles. They didn't even have license plates. I think I spotted something splayed out on the asphalt on stretchers, either wounded people or dead. We were guided to the staff parking lot around the back. A handful of other vehicles were parked, and about 24 people surrounding them, mostly volunteer staff. They were handing out search locations, shouting out rules, and telling people who to pair up with and how. But Jerry wasn't having it. In the flashing red and blue lights, I could tell he was having second thoughts. He turned to me and lowered his voice. "I don't think she'd just run into the woods," he said. "I think she's going home." "Then why didn't you stay home?" "Not our home," he said, shaking his head. "The place where she feels most home." There was a secret picnic spot not too far from there. It was where Jerry had proposed. A large field, covered in flowers, with a single 4-bench picnic table that had been overgrown since the early 90s. The place was abandoned, but it was one of Susie's favorite spots in the world. And maybe it was just a hunch, but that's where Jerry felt that she was going. All this talk of beauty might have gotten him thinking about it. We had to go off-road and park on a slope, walking up a hill in the dark. There was a full moon out, but the light was covered in a spotty cloud cover. The sky was passing so fast that you felt like you were moving even when standing still. We made our way through an overgrown trail, past a dense pine forest, and saw the woods open into a clearing. And there she was. I saw her from about 200 feet away, standing on a picnic table, staring at the moon. She'd gotten her dress back, but it was torn and disheveled beyond repair. It had gone from a majestic wedding dress to something that barely covered her knees. It was torn, dirty, frayed, and bloody, much like Susie herself. She barely had any hair left. Her eyes were sunken into her head, making her whole face seem smaller. Her chapped lips were drawn back into a permanent half-smile, straining against the shape of her cranium. Her fingers were broken and bruised, and she stood on the tip of her toes, doing a balancing act as she slowly moved her arms around. All without rhythm, rhyme, or reason. This was beyond a pattern. It was surreal, and the image has seared into my head. It still comes to mind when I catch some abstract dance number on TikTok, and when it does, it gives me chills. But that night I didn't just have chills. I was scared. I'd seen a lot of things in my life up until that point, but there was just something unreal about this. It wasn't just madness, it was commitment. Susie knew something we didn't. We approached her slowly. As we got closer, her head turned to us, her eyes darting between me and Jerry. They seemed to move independently of one another. I could see a crack in the corner of her mouth as her involuntary smile twisted into a full-grown grin. "Susie, we gotta go home," Jerry pleaded. "I don't want you getting hurt." She turned her back on him, looking out into the fields beyond. Whatever she saw there was something far more interesting than what I and Jerry could offer. Still, he didn't give up. He begged her to step down from the table and come to him. He talked about the adventures they'd had and the challenges they'd overcome. And yet, Susie didn't budge. I wasn't really paying attention to what Jerry was saying. I was looking the same way as Susie. What was she really seeing? Was there something there? You know the way a ray of light can catch your eye? A reflection off a piece of jewelry or a watch, and how it can sting your eye out of nowhere. That's how I felt. I followed Susie's eyes and I saw something. Not in the night sky, but in the tree line on the other side of the glade. Looking at it stung me. It burned. It was uncomfortable, much like a ray of unwanted sun. I recoiled and regained my balance. Jerry stopped in his tracks, looking over at me. I nodded that I was fine. He looked back at Susie, but I tapped him on the shoulder. He turned his attention back to me. "Don't look," I wheezed. "Don't look." But it was impossible not to. Although it burned me, I couldn't help but to look. There was something moving towards us. I couldn't see a shape because it had none. It was like looking at an uncomfortable feeling and having it bury into your head. I could only look at it in short bursts, but I still couldn't help myself. Susie, on the other hand, was staring at it. She didn't dare close her eyes. As her hand movements relaxed and slowed, I saw her shoulder slump. "They think I'm beautiful," she cried. "They'll make me perfect." "Susie, what are you?" "They can help you too," she sniffled. "We can both go." Then she turned to us, her eyes trembling like a cold dog. She smiled at me with missing teeth, revealing a bloody tongue. Her left eye found me. "You too," she said. You can come too." Jerry not only stopped, but stepped back. He could feel it too. We were being threatened. There was no way Susie could overpower us both, but that wouldn't matter. She wasn't the threat here, and we didn't even understand what was. But looking across the field, I could tell it was coming closer, leaving a trail of flattened grass as it beelined towards us. "Come on, Jerry," she laughed. "Hurry!" He fell backwards, covering his face with his hands. Something in me told me that I ought to do the same, but I didn't. Instead, I turned back to Susie. Whatever was moving out there had reached her, looming over her like a storm cloud. I could feel it. The longer I looked at it, the more complex the sensation. At first, it was like a burning pain behind the eyes, leaving a cold and exposed nerve. That nerve tingled with a resonance, painting pictures in my mind like a seismograph. It was happening faster and faster, leaving only fleeting impressions of a being. It had arms longer than bone and skin. It knew words that gave way to thought. It was perfect, beautiful, and real. Maybe the realest thing I'd ever felt. A transcendent something that had gone past the physical and the immediate, instead surviving as an ideal, as the most beautiful thing you could imagine. Fleeting, ever-changing, ever-inviting, and impossible to put into form. This was what Susie had been chasing. She had made herself a mockery in an attempt to create something that couldn't be, and it had recognized her efforts. Looking at Susie for one final time, she screamed with ecstatic joy. And in the blink of an eye, it happened. Her flesh unraveled into a transparent jelly. Her arms bent, snapped, and unfurled into frayed knots, eyes glowing a pure white as her tongue boiled behind crackling teeth. I saw her head twist like a balloon in a storm as her spine left her body. And she laughed. She laughed and cheered to the very end, overjoyed as to come what may. Then she was just gone, dress and all, leaving nothing but a spatter of sizzling stains on the edge of the picnic table. Something turned to me. Even without looking at it, I could feel it looking. Despite everything in me screaming to look away and to deny, there was a part of me that was drawn in by what I'd seen in Susie. Her joy was as pure could get. I wanted to accept it, to explore it. The picture in my mind was growing clearer, and I remember feeling this unearthly sense of peace. I didn't just belong, I was meant to be, and I was beautiful. But luckily, Jerry was there. He dragged me down, screaming at me to snap out of it. I hadn't even noticed it, but I was laughing. I'd been staring at my hands, as if they held some kind of answer. What was I doing? Realizing how close I'd been to losing control, I just hugged my brother and cried. He was inconsolable. We could barely form words as whatever presence we'd felt dissipated, leaving us alone in the dirt. Ugly, imperfect, and ourselves. Over the weeks to come, we'd get a bit more context as to what had happened. 2 caretakers had mysteriously disappeared, and a third had been found dead in the break room. The death was described as an accident, but from what eyewitnesses have been telling me, he died in a way that can only be described as a man going through a full-body microwaving. Susie, well, she was just reported missing. What else was there to say? There was no sign of her, and Jerry couldn't very well say that she evaporated. Instead, he was tortured for weeks, asked to keep his chin up, and getting constant reminders that hope was always the last thing to die. They didn't know any better. They didn't know that hope died with a laugh. I think back on that night a lot. I wish it had had a face. I wish I could visualize this singular thing to put into words what this looked like. But it's impossible. There are no words to describe it. Sometimes in the shower, I try to make up new words for it. They come naturally to me, but I sound completely mad. Nowadays, when I look in the mirror, I don't really see flaws. Not like I used to. I don't see my nose as a little crooked, or my teeth as a little yellow. No, it's bigger than that. It's the sense of being stuck in something static and unchanging. Confined. I find myself dreaming of being this cosmic jellyfish, floating formlessly through nothing, barely held together by anything but vague remains of what I was supposed to be. I'm sorry. It's strange. It's really, really strange. And so ungodly beautiful.